My name is Angela, and I never thought my life would end that day. It was supposed to be just another winter morning, cold but peaceful. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale glow over the frozen streets. A thick layer of ice covered everything outside, and the trees stood still under the weight of frost. The world seemed quiet, untouched, almost as if time itself had slowed. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped out of my house, my breath forming small clouds in the air. It was early, and the neighborhood was still asleep. The only sound was the faint crunch of ice beneath my boots. I was just heading to my car like I always did, my mind already occupied with thoughts about the day ahead, errands that needed to be run, work that needed to be done, calls I had to make. It was just another day, another morning like so many before. Then, before I even realized what was happening, my foot slipped. It happened so fast that I didn't have time to react. One moment, I was walking toward my car, my keys gripped tightly in my gloved hand, and the next, the ground had disappeared from beneath me. There was no time to brace myself, no way to stop what was coming. My body lurched backward, and before I could even process the fall, my head struck the icy pavement. A sharp pain shot through my skull, but it lasted only a moment before everything around me blurred. The sky above me twisted, the pale morning light flickering like a candle about to go out. My ears rang, and then, just as suddenly as it had happened, everything went silent. The cold that had numbed my skin only seconds ago was gone. The pain in my head vanished. The weight of my body, the feeling of the icy pavement pressing against my back, all of it disappeared in an instant. I was gone. But what happened next changed everything. And before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you're here, it's because you're meant to hear this message. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay until the end. What I saw on the other side is something you cannot afford to miss. I should have been terrified. I should have felt panic, confusion, something, anything. But instead, I felt the exact opposite. There was no fear, no distress, no pain. Only warmth. A sensation so overwhelming and pure that it filled every part of me. It wasn't just physical warmth, like stepping into a heated room after being outside in the cold. It was deeper than that, something I had never known before. It surrounded me, held me, as if I were being embraced by something far greater than anything I had ever experienced. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't on the freezing ground anymore. The winter sky, the ice-covered pavement, my neighborhood, all of it was gone. I was somewhere else. At first, I couldn't understand where I was. Everything around me was light. Not the harsh artificial kind, but a soft, living glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't blinding, but it wasn't dim either. It was as if the very air carried its own radiance, a light that didn't just illuminate the space, but filled it with something more. There were no shadows, no corners left in darkness. The light was everywhere, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. I took a step forward, but my feet didn't feel the ground beneath me in the way they normally would. I wasn't floating, and yet I wasn't bound by weight. There was no heaviness, no strain on my body, no aching from the fall. Everything about me felt different, lighter, freer, as if I had been released from something I hadn't even realized was holding me back. Then I felt it. A presence. I didn't hear footsteps. There was no sound to announce that someone was near. But I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. It was as if the very air carried the awareness of someone else. Someone powerful. Someone beyond my understanding. And at that moment, the warmth around me grew even stronger, filling me with something I can only describe as peace. I turned, and there he was. I had never seen him before, not like this. But I knew. There was no doubt in my heart, no hesitation in my mind. I knew exactly who he was. Jesus. He stood before me, watching me. His expression was calm, yet filled with something deeper, something beyond human comprehension. His presence radiated more love than I had ever known in my entire life. It wasn't just love as we understand it. It was complete. Absolute. There was no fear in his presence. No shame. No sense of unworthiness. Only a complete and total understanding. I had spent my whole life believing in him, praying to him, speaking his name. But standing before him now, I realized that no words, no sermons, no songs could have ever truly captured what it meant to be in his presence. It wasn't just his appearance, it was who he was. Every part of me felt known in that moment. Every thought I had ever had, every doubt, every moment of joy, every mistake, and yet, I was not afraid. He saw all of it. And still, his love for me remained unchanged. I wanted to speak. To say something, anything. But before I could, he lifted his hand ever so slightly, and in that moment, something passed between us. Not in words. Not in sound. But in understanding. I didn't need to ask where I was. I already knew. I was no longer in the world I had known. I had died. But death was not what I had thought it would be. It wasn't an end. It wasn't darkness. It wasn't nothingness. It was something more. It was a transition. A moment of crossing from one existence to another. And yet, something about this moment felt significant, as if this was not the end of my journey, but the beginning of something else. Then Jesus looked at me, his eyes holding a sorrow that I hadn't expected. There was love. There was peace. But there was also something else, something that felt like longing. Like sadness. Not for himself. But for what he was about to show me. There is something you need to see, he said. The moment the words left his lips, everything around me shifted. The light that had surrounded us didn't disappear, but it dimmed slightly. And before I could fully process what was happening, the world around me changed. I wasn't in that peaceful place anymore. I was somewhere else. And what I saw next would change everything I thought I knew. The world around me was nothing like the one I had just left behind. I wasn't lying on the frozen ground anymore. I wasn't feeling the sharp sting of cold against my skin. I wasn't bound by the weight of my body. Instead, I was standing in a place I could barely describe, a place that felt more real than anything I had ever known. The air itself seemed alive, carrying a warmth that wasn't just physical but something deeper, something that touched every part of me. There was light all around me, but it didn't come from a single source. It wasn't like the sun casting rays from above or a lamp illuminating one spot. It was everywhere at once, filling the space, wrapping around me in a way that made me feel completely safe. Completely at peace. It wasn't blinding, and yet it was more brilliant than any light I had ever seen. I looked down at myself, expecting to see my coat, my gloves, my boots, everything I had been wearing before I fell. But none of it was there. I wasn't even sure if I had a body in the way I had always known it. I could move. I could feel. I could think. But there was no pain. No cold. No sensation of weight or discomfort. I wasn't burdened by anything. Not even gravity itself. It was as if I was still me, but without all the limitations that had come with being human before. Then, before I could fully take in what was happening, I felt something. Something beyond the light. Beyond the warmth. It wasn't something I heard or saw, but something I knew. Instantly. A presence. One so strong, so pure, so overwhelmingly powerful that I should have felt afraid. But I wasn't. I turned. And he was there. I didn't need anyone to tell me who he was. There was no hesitation, no doubt in my heart or mind. I knew. It was Jesus. He stood just a few feet away from me, watching me with eyes that held more love than I had ever known. He didn't have to say anything. In that single moment, with just one look, I felt everything. My entire life was laid bare before him. Not in a way that made me feel ashamed, but in a way that made me realize how deeply he had always known me. Every thought I had ever had. Every joy. Every sorrow. Every mistake. Every regret. It was all there. And he saw it all. But there was no condemnation in his gaze. No anger. No disappointment. Only love. A love so deep, so complete, so unlike anything I had ever experienced that it made everything else I had ever called love feel small in comparison. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask where I was. What was happening? Why I was standing before him instead of waking up in a hospital somewhere. But the words didn't come. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I didn't need to. He already knew everything I wanted to say. Then, finally, he spoke. There is something you need to see. As soon as the words left his lips, the world around us changed. The light didn't disappear, but it shifted. The warmth remained, but suddenly, I was no longer standing in that peaceful space. The ground beneath me felt more solid, and before I could fully process the shift, I realized that we were no longer alone. I was looking at something. Something that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I saw people. Cities. Streets filled with movement. At first glance, everything seemed normal. People were going about their lives. Talking. Working. Laughing. Carrying on with their daily routines. But the more I watched, the more I realized that something was wrong. Jesus stood beside me, watching, waiting for me to see what he already knew. At first, I didn't understand. I saw families gathering. People attending church. Communities coming together. It looked like people were living their lives as they always had. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became. There was division everywhere. Not just in the way people spoke or interacted, but in their hearts. I saw the way they looked at one another. The unspoken judgments. The hidden resentments. The deep-rooted anger that had been passed down through generations. I saw people clinging to pain. Refusing to let go of the past. Using it as a reason to keep others at a distance. I saw groups separating themselves. Creating barriers that were never meant to exist. And then, I saw something even more heartbreaking. Even within the churches, the division remained. I saw congregations that claimed to worship the same God, but refused to stand together. I saw people who spoke of unity, but lived in separation. I saw places where love was preached, but not practiced. And as I watched, I realized that so many of them had no idea what they had lost. They do not see each other as I see them, Jesus said, his voice filled with sadness. I turned to him, my heart heavy. Why is it like this? They have forgotten, he said simply. The weight of his words settled over me. I knew what he meant. Humanity had been created in his image. Each person crafted by his hand. Each one carrying a part of his love. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped seeing each other that way. We had started defining ourselves by things that were never meant to separate us. Race. Nationality. Status. Culture. All of it had been used to build walls instead of bridges. And for the first time, I saw just how deeply those walls had been built. I watched as people carried wounds that weren't even their own. As pain from the past shaped the way they treated one another in the present. Some held on to their suffering, allowing it to turn into anger. Others ignored the pain altogether, refusing to acknowledge what had been done. And in the middle of it all, I saw a world that was blind to the very thing that could heal it. Him. Jesus looked at me, his expression unreadable. But his eyes held something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just sadness. It was urgency. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just something I was meant to see. This was something I was meant to do something about. The scene around me shifted so suddenly that I barely had time to process what was happening. One moment, I was standing in the warmth of that endless light, surrounded by a peace unlike anything I had ever known. The next, I was somewhere entirely different. I wasn't in that heavenly place anymore. I was looking down at the world. Seeing it from a perspective I had never imagined before. Below me, the earth stretched out in all directions. Cities stood tall. Streets bustled with movement. People filled every space I could see. Everything looked so normal at first. The quiet suburbs. The towering skyscrapers. The small villages. The crowded markets. The churches. The homes. Life continued as it always had. But then, I began to notice things I had never truly seen before. Or maybe I had seen them, but never really understood their depth. People were divided. Not just by the physical barriers of land and borders. Not just by language or culture. But by something deeper. Something that had taken root in their hearts and shaped the way they saw one another. I watched as they moved through their daily lives. Passing one another in the streets. Standing next to each other in stores. Sitting in the same rooms. But still feeling worlds apart. There was judgment in their eyes. Subtle at times. Obvious in others. I saw the way some people looked at those who were different from them. With suspicion. With hesitation. With unspoken assumptions built over generations. I saw how groups turned against groups. How history had left wounds that had never fully healed. How old injustices had transformed into new resentments. Some had suffered oppression and carried the weight of it in their hearts, allowing the pain to settle so deeply that it became anger. A quiet rage that shaped their view of the world. Others clung to power, afraid of what would happen if they let go. Afraid to see others rise. Afraid of losing something they believed was theirs to keep. Jesus stood beside me, watching the same scene unfold before us. There was sorrow in his expression. Not anger. Not frustration. Just a deep sadness for what had become of his creation. All were made in my image, he said, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver through me. But look at what has happened. His words lingered in the air, pressing into me. Forcing me to truly take in what I was seeing. This wasn't just a surface-level problem. This wasn't just people disagreeing or misunderstanding one another. This was something much deeper. Something spiritual. I looked closer and saw how tightly people clung to their identities. Not as children of God, but as something else. Some held on to their race, their nationality, their status, their affiliations, as if those things defined their worth, as if they were the most important parts of who they were. They placed those identities above everything else, even above God. I saw people using past wounds as reasons to build walls, reasons to hate, reasons to stay separate. I saw others who ignored history altogether, refusing to acknowledge the suffering of those who had come before them, unwilling to listen, unwilling to understand. It was painful to witness, and I could feel the weight of it settling over me. A heaviness I had never carried before. This was not how things were meant to be. This was not what God had intended for his people. They do not see each other as I see them, Jesus said, his voice filled with sorrow. I looked up at him, my heart heavy with the truth of what he was showing me. Why is it like this? I asked, even though deep down I already knew the answer. They have forgotten, he replied. And in that moment, I understood exactly what he meant. Humanity had been created in his image. Each person crafted by his hand. Each soul a reflection of his love. But over time, people had stopped seeing that. They had started defining themselves by things that were never meant to separate them. Race. Nationality. Social status. Political views. All of it had been used to build walls instead of bridges. People had allowed those differences to take priority over their identity in Christ. I saw how it had crept into every part of society. How it had shaped cultures. Shaped families. Shaped the way people spoke to one another. Thought about one another. Treated one another. It wasn't just about history. It wasn't just about injustice. It was about how people had let those things become bigger than love. Bigger than forgiveness. Bigger than their calling to be one in him. And then, I saw something that made my stomach sink even further. The division wasn't just in the world. It was in the church. I saw congregations where people worshiped the same God, but refused to stand together. Some churches were divided by race. Some by culture. Some by unspoken lines that kept people apart, even when they sat in the same room. I saw believers who claimed to follow Christ, but still carried prejudice in their hearts. I saw others who thought they were above it all, blind to the ways they had contributed to the separation. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Jesus continued to watch, his expression unchanged. But I could feel the sadness radiating from him. "This is not what I wanted," he said. His voice was quiet, but filled with certainty. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to understand how things had gotten this way. People had convinced themselves that their differences mattered more than their unity, that their pain, their struggles, their experiences were too great to overcome. But what they had forgotten was that none of those things could compare to the love of God. None of them could compare to the sacrifice Jesus had made for every single person, regardless of where they came from, what they looked like, or what they had been through. The enemy had blinded them, twisting their vision, making them believe that they were too different, too divided, to ever truly be one. And because of that, people had stopped trying. I turned back to Jesus, my chest tight with emotion. "Can it be changed?" His eyes met mine, filled with the same love I had seen from the beginning. "They must remember who they are," he said simply. "They must return to me." It wasn't just about acknowledging the problem. It wasn't just about admitting that division existed. It was about going back to the truth. Back to the one thing that could heal what had been broken. People had spent so much time looking at one another through the lens of the world. Through history. Through pain. Through differences. That they had stopped looking at each other through the eyes of God. And until that changed, nothing else would. This message is too important to ignore. Jesus is calling us back to him, and time is running out. If you've made it this far, it's because you were meant to hear this. Now, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel so that more people can hear this truth. Leave a comment if this message spoke to you. And most importantly, don't just listen. Act. Because Jesus is waiting. The vision shifted again, and I suddenly saw time moving in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if I was standing outside of history, watching it unfold like the pages of a book, flipping too quickly to grasp any one moment completely. Yet, I understood everything that was happening. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the shaping of nations, the way humanity had divided itself over and over again. At first, the images were beautiful. People working together, building, creating, discovering. But then, something changed. I saw people being forced from their homes, families torn apart, their freedom taken away. I saw chains, whips, ships filled with human beings, treated as less than human. I saw faces filled with pain, fear, and hopelessness. Slavery, war, oppression. Things I had read about. Things I had learned in history books. But now, I was seeing them through the eyes of those who had lived it. The suffering didn't stop when the chains were removed, or when wars ended. It lingered, passed down from generation to generation. Some carrying anger, some carrying guilt, others carrying wounds so deep they never fully healed. Jesus stood beside me, watching, and his sorrow was almost too much to bear. They were meant to love one another, he said. But they chose fear instead. I continued to watch as history moved forward. The names and faces changed, but the division remained. Some were told they were lesser because of the way they looked, where they were born, or the language they spoke. Others clung to power, afraid to lose their place. afraid to admit the wrongs that had been done before them. Then I saw leaders, powerful voices rising at different points in time. Some of them fought for truth, for justice, for healing. But others used division for their own gain. Some were political, convincing people that they had to hate one another to protect themselves. They told them that unity was impossible, that the only way to survive was to keep their distance, to separate, to fear those who were different. They disguised control as security, turning people against each other, feeding their insecurities and pain instead of offering solutions. But it wasn't just in governments. I saw religious leaders, people who were supposed to represent God, standing behind pulpits, preaching messages that deepened the divide instead of healing it. Some used scripture to justify oppression, twisting the words of God to support their own biases. Others ignored the suffering of those around them, refusing to acknowledge injustice because it was easier to pretend it didn't exist. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I watched as people absorbed these messages, believing them, allowing them to shape the way they saw each other, the way they saw the world. And the enemy, he was watching too. He was fueling it, whispering lies into the ears of the powerful, into the ears of the hurting, into the ears of those who wanted to do what was right but didn't know how. It wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about power. It was about division in every form. I saw people fighting over things that didn't matter. Over status, over wealth, over traditions. I saw people who claimed to love God, refusing to love their neighbors, because of differences that should have never mattered. I saw families broken, communities torn apart, churches splitting over arguments that had nothing to do with eternity. And then I saw something even worse. Even within the walls of the church, the division remained. Some congregations were completely separated, their members all looking the same, living the same, staying in their own groups, without ever opening their doors to anyone different. Some preached messages of unity, but lived in quiet segregation, never reaching beyond their comfort zones, never asking why the divide still existed. Others refused to acknowledge the pain of the past, acting as if history had no impact on the present, expecting people to simply move on without acknowledging what had been done. Jesus looked at me, his voice filled with sorrow, but also with a firmness that sent chills through me. "This is not what I wanted," he said. "I made them all. I love them all. But they have forgotten." The weight of his words settled deep in my soul. The truth was painful, but it was undeniable. Humanity had forgotten who they were, forgotten that they had all been created by the same hands, loved by the same God. They had allowed themselves to be divided, to believe the lie that they were meant to be separate, that their differences mattered more than what they had in common. I turned to Jesus, my heart aching. "How do they fix it?" I asked. "How do they undo what has already been done?" His expression didn't change. "They must return to me," he said simply. "Only my love can heal what the world has broken." The vision shifted again, and I felt my soul bracing for what he was about to show me next. I knew that what I had seen was only part of the truth, that there was more I needed to understand, more that I needed to carry back with me. And deep down, I knew that the answer wasn't just for the world. It was for me too. Jesus lifted his hand, and in an instant, my perspective changed. I was no longer watching from the outside, no longer looking at history as an observer. Instead, I was seeing people the way he saw them. And it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I didn't see race. I didn't see nationality. I didn't see the markers that humanity had used to separate itself for so long. I saw souls. And they were all the same. There was no division, no hierarchy, no one standing above another. There were no privileged and no forgotten, no chosen and no rejected. Each soul carried the same value, the same light, the same essence of God's love. There was no such thing as someone being worth more because of where they were born or what they looked like. There was no such thing as someone being worth less because of the circumstances they had been born into. They were His. And that was the only thing that mattered. And then I saw the pain. I saw people who had been hurt by racism, by oppression, by rejection. I saw their wounds. Not physical, but spiritual, etched into their very souls. Some of them carried scars passed down from generations before them. Wounds that had never been allowed to heal. Pain that had been reinforced over and over again by the world around them. And Jesus felt their pain. I could see it in His eyes, in the way He looked at them. He was not distant from their suffering. He had been there. In every moment of their oppression, in every injustice, in every time they had been made to feel less than what He had created them to be. He had seen every insult, every exclusion, every act of cruelty, and He had wept for them. He had never turned away. But then I saw something else, something I hadn't expected. I saw people who had been falsely accused, people who had been burdened with guilt for things they had never done, people who carried the weight of history on their shoulders even though their own hands had never caused harm. Some had been born into privilege they had never asked for, and they lived in fear of being hated simply because of the past. Others had tried to help, tried to bring healing, but had been pushed away, rejected, told they would never understand. And Jesus felt their pain too. He had seen those who struggled to reconcile history with their present, those who wanted to make things right but didn't know how. He had seen people trying to bridge the gap only to be met with suspicion, met with walls built from years of hurt. He had seen the way division had been kept alive, not just by those who wanted to oppress, but by those who had been wounded so deeply that they didn't know how to move forward without carrying the past with them. It was all pain, and Jesus carried all of it. I understood then. The answer wasn't to ignore race, to pretend that history hadn't happened, to act as though the pain of the past had no effect on the present. The answer wasn't to dismiss the wounds of those who had suffered, nor was it to place blame on those who had never committed the sins of their ancestors. The answer wasn't to hold on to anger, or to let guilt divide people even further. The answer was Him. Only His love could heal what the world had broken. I saw for the first time how the enemy had used race as a tool to divide people, how he had taken something that God had created as beautiful, diversity, culture, uniqueness, and twisted it into something that caused pain, separation, and hatred. Instead of people seeing different races as expressions of God's creativity, they had been taught to see them as barriers, as reasons to stay apart, as excuses to elevate one group over another. And I realized how much time humanity had wasted, fighting battles that God never intended them to fight. Jesus had never created one race to be superior to another. He had never chosen one group to be above the rest. Every single human being had been created with the same love, the same purpose, to know Him, and to love one another. Yet the world had twisted this truth. People had been conditioned to believe that their differences were more important than their unity. They had been led to think that their skin color, their nationality, their background, defined them more than their identity as children of God. Some had been taught to see themselves as less, while others had been taught to see themselves as greater. And in the process, they had all forgotten the truth. I saw what the world had gotten wrong. It wasn't wrong to acknowledge race, to see the beauty in different cultures, to recognize that history had left wounds that needed healing. But it was wrong to let those things become more important than the love of Christ. It was wrong to let past pain dictate future relationships. It was wrong to let anger and division become stronger than the call to forgive and unite. I watched as Jesus stretched out his hand. And suddenly, I saw people reaching for one another. Choosing love instead of resentment. Choosing reconciliation instead of separation. Choosing to see each other as God saw them, instead of how the world had conditioned them to see. I saw churches breaking down the walls that had kept them apart for so long. I saw families learning to heal, to talk, to listen. I saw people letting go of bitterness. Not because their pain didn't matter, but because they refused to let it define them anymore. And for the first time, I saw hope. Jesus looked at me again, and I knew what he was telling me. This wasn't just a vision for me to witness. This was a truth I needed to take back with me. A message that needed to be spoken. The world would continue to tell people that they were too different, too divided, too broken, to ever come together. But Jesus had already paid the price for unity. He had already made a way for healing. He had already provided the only solution that could ever truly mend what had been torn apart. People just needed to see. They needed to see each other the way he saw them. And that was the only way everything would change. The vision shifted again, and what I saw next was unlike anything I had ever witnessed before. After seeing the pain, the division, and the weight of history that had shaped the way people saw one another, I was now shown something different. Something that I never thought I would see in this world. I saw forgiveness. Not just words. Not just forced gestures. But true, deep, and complete forgiveness. I saw people who had been carrying the weight of resentment for years. For generations even. Suddenly letting go. It was as if they had been holding on to chains they never realized were wrapped around their hearts. And in an instant, those chains were released. I watched as individuals who had suffered genuine oppression, mistreatment, and rejection chose to move forward. Not by ignoring what had happened, but by refusing to let it control them any longer. I saw people embracing, weeping together, breaking down the walls that had been built between them. It wasn't shallow. It wasn't forced. It was real. Jesus stood beside me, watching, his expression full of love. "This is what I desire," he said, "that they love one another." I saw churches uniting. Not because they had been told to. Not because they felt obligated. But because they truly saw each other as family. There were no longer separate places of worship for different groups. No unspoken divisions that kept people in their own corners. Instead, people came together. Because they all belonged to the same kingdom. They weren't gathered under a flag, a nationality, or a social status. They weren't divided by history or tradition. They were simply God's people. Standing together. Worshipping together. Living together in unity. It was something so simple. And yet, the world had complicated it. The enemy had spent generations convincing people that unity was impossible. That their differences were too great to overcome. That the wounds of the past could never truly heal. But Jesus was showing me the truth. He was showing me what could happen if people simply chose to see each other the way he saw them. I saw families teaching their children not to carry the burdens of division into the next generation. I saw parents telling their sons and daughters that they didn't have to inherit hatred. That they could choose a different path. I saw young people refusing to let history dictate their relationships. Choosing instead to build something new. Something that looked like heaven on earth. This is how they move forward, Jesus said. Not by ignoring what has happened, but by choosing love despite it. I felt those words sink deep into my soul. For so long, the world had taught people that moving forward meant either pretending the past didn't exist, or using it as fuel for more division. But neither of those things led to healing. Real healing didn't come from forgetting. It came from acknowledging the pain and choosing love anyway. I saw people reaching across the barriers that had once seemed impossible to cross. I saw churches inviting one another in, no longer seeing themselves as separate groups, but as one body in Christ. I saw people no longer defining themselves by the color of their skin, by their background, or by their nationality, but simply by their identity as children of God. And then, I saw something even more powerful. I saw leaders choosing truth over fear. Political leaders, pastors, teachers, people who had once been afraid to speak about unity because they didn't want to offend anyone, because they didn't know how to approach the conversation. I saw them standing up and declaring what Jesus had always wanted: love, unity, reconciliation, not as ideas, not as distant dreams, but as a way of life. For so long, people had been afraid to talk about race, about injustice, about the divisions that existed in the world. Some had avoided the conversation altogether, while others had used it to create more anger, more bitterness, more pain. But I saw leaders who were no longer afraid. They weren't afraid to say that racism had hurt people. They weren't afraid to say that the past had created real wounds. But they also weren't afraid to say that Jesus was the only answer. They weren't afraid to call people to repentance. Not just those who had caused harm, but also those who had refused to forgive. They weren't afraid to say that the world's way of solving division had failed, and that the only way forward was through Jesus alone. I saw revival, not just in churches, but in homes, in schools, in governments, in communities. It wasn't the kind of revival where people simply filled church pews. It was a revival of the heart. People were waking up, realizing that they had spent too long letting the enemy keep them apart, letting history define their future, letting bitterness hold them back from the full freedom Jesus had already paid for. And I saw something else, too. I saw people truly listening to one another, not listening to respond, not listening to argue, but listening to understand. I saw people willing to hear the pain of others without becoming defensive. I saw those who had suffered finding peace in the fact that their pain was acknowledged. I saw those who had been misunderstood being given the chance to show their hearts. People weren't looking at each other as oppressors or victims, as enemies or threats. They were looking at each other as brothers and sisters. This was how we move forward, not by ignoring history, but by refusing to let history define our relationships today. Not by seeking revenge, but by seeking understanding. Not by holding on to resentment, but by choosing to forgive even when it feels impossible. Not by separating ourselves into groups, but by realizing that in Christ we are already one. Jesus turned to me again, his eyes full of love, and yet filled with the same urgency as before. They must not wait for the world to tell them when to love, he said. They must choose love now. I felt the weight of his words settle deep in my spirit. He wasn't just showing me what could be. He was showing me what must be. It wasn't enough for people to hope for unity. It wasn't enough for them to say the right things in public, while holding on to resentment in private. They had to make the choice to forgive, to love, to yield, to walk forward together as one. And in that moment, I knew this was why he had sent me back. Because the world needed to hear this. And because the time to change wasn't someday in the future. It was now. Everything around me shifted in an instant. The vision of people uniting. The overwhelming love of Jesus. The hope that had filled my soul. It all faded. I felt something pulling me away. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent. But it was undeniable. I was being drawn backward, away from the presence of Jesus, away from the place where I had seen so much truth. I turned to him, desperate to hold on, to stay just a little longer. There was so much more I wanted to understand, so much I hadn't asked. But before I could speak, Jesus met my eyes, a look of deep love and unwavering certainty. "Go back," he said. "Tell them." His voice was gentle, but there was a weight behind it, a weight that left no room for hesitation. This wasn't a request. This was a mission, a command. Before I could even respond, before I could ask how, everything around me collapsed into darkness. The warmth disappeared. The light faded. The peace that had surrounded me just moments ago was gone. And then I gasped for air. The cold hit me like a wave, sharp, unforgiving. My lungs burned as they struggled to pull in oxygen, my chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Every part of my body ached. My head throbbed. I became aware of the solid ground beneath me. The world around me felt heavy, too real, too harsh. After where I had just been, I wasn't in that heavenly place anymore. I was back. A voice called my name, distant at first, then growing clearer. Someone was shaking me, their hands gripping my shoulders, their panicked breaths visible in the freezing air. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Angela, oh my God, are you okay?" I recognized the voice. It was my neighbor, the one who had seen me lying motionless on the ground and had rushed to my side. I tried to speak, but my lips felt numb, my body still trying to catch up with my spirit. "You weren't breathing," she said, her voice shaky. I thought. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I called an ambulance." "Just stay still." I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell her that I had seen Jesus? That I had left this world entirely? That I had been given a message so urgent? That he had sent me back? I didn't have time to process any of it. The sirens were already approaching, flashing lights reflecting off the icy pavement. As the paramedics arrived, I was lifted onto a stretcher. Questions being thrown at me. Voices overlapping. They checked my pulse, my breathing, shined a light into my eyes, trying to understand how I had survived a fall like that, how I had gone without oxygen, and was still here, fully conscious. But even as they spoke to me, even as they wrapped me in blankets and tried to keep me awake, all I could think about was what I had just left behind. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen the truth about the world, about humanity, about the way forward. And now, I was back. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I answered what little I could, saying I had slipped on the ice, that I had lost consciousness, that I didn't remember much after the fall. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened. No one would believe me if I told them the truth. Not yet, at least. Lying in that hospital bed later, staring up at the ceiling, I felt different. It wasn't just that I had survived something that should have killed me. It was that I wasn't the same person who had fallen that morning. Something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in every part of me. A knowing so deep that it felt like it had been written into my very soul. I had been sent back for a reason. Jesus had told me, "Tell them." But tell them what? How could I even begin to put into words what I had seen? How could I explain the way he had looked at humanity? The love in his eyes? The pain he carried? For the division and suffering that people continued to inflict on one another? How could I explain The unity that was possible? The healing that was real? The forgiveness that was necessary? The weight of it all pressed against my chest. But beneath it, there was something else. A fire. A certainty. That I couldn't ignore. I had to speak. It didn't matter if people doubted me. It didn't matter if some rejected what I said. I had been given this experience for a reason. And I couldn't stay silent. Lying there, staring at the fluorescent lights above me, I whispered the words to myself, letting them settle into my spirit. I will tell them. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning.